Incident Log 40 Green, Regional Communications Enforcement Division, timestamp withheld. Unauthorized transmission detected on decommissioned military frequency. Source traced to private residence, Etheridge County. Classification, civilian interference, likely amateur equipment operating outside FCC exemption. Recommend immediate cease and desist, seizure of equipment if resistance offered. Priority, shut down before contamination of adjacent bands. The memo said nothing about who Curtis Ledbetter was. It said nothing about 24 years, or a walnut cabinet, or a chair that had sat empty and dusted for 11 of them. It said interference, and it said immediate, and 40 minutes after a garbled voice first bled static across a frequency nobody had touched in 3 decades, 5 black vehicles turned off the county road and came up his gravel drive in a column tight enough to be a single dark animal. A signal comes in on a frequency that has not been used by anyone for anything in over 3 decades, and one old farmer is the only person on earth who still recognizes its rhythm. Curtis heard the first crackle of it at 4 minutes past 9, sitting where he always sat, and by the time the convoy's headlights swept his porch, he had already written 3 words on a scrap of feed sack paper and folded it into his shirt pocket without looking at it again. If you've ever kept a ritual going for someone who can't sit beside you anymore, you already understand why Curtis never turned that second antenna off. The barn held the day's heat, the way it always did at dusk in late spring. Warmth banked low along the floor and rising slow through the rafters, and Curtis moved through it on the same path he'd worn into the boards for 11 years, a path that bent around a stool, a feed bin, and nothing else, because his knees now told him where to walk before his eyes did. He wore the barn coat he wore every evening regardless of season, canvas gone soft and colorless at the cuffs, buttoned collar shirt beneath it closed to the throat, though the night was warm enough to leave it open. He set 2 chairs by the workbench the way he set them every night, his own, cane-bottomed, angled to catch the dial's glow, and beside it, a second chair, seat wiped clean of dust that no longer had the chance to settle, because he dusted it before he sat, every single evening, whether anyone was there to see it or not. The receiver sat on its shelf in a walnut cabinet he'd built with his own hands the winter after he came home, vacuum tubes glowing faint amber through the ventilation slots, a brass tuning knob worn down to bare metal on one side, where 2 fingers had turned it the same 20 degrees of arc for longer than most men live. The dial face was hand-marked in grease pencil, frequencies noted in a script only he could read anymore, numbers laid down and touched up across years until the markings themselves had become a kind of biography. He turned his head before he touched the knob, tilting it so his right ear led, because the left had gone quiet from decades pressed close to transmitter housings, and a man learns to trust what he still has, rather than mourn what the work took from him. He did not explain the second chair to anyone in town, not to the Farm Bureau woman who came to check his well permit, not to the boy who delivered feed, not even to the sheriff's deputy who sometimes idled past on a welfare check and lingered a beat too long at the barn door. He had built a second antenna mast into the roofline years back, unlicensed, wired straight into the receiver, and every night at the same hour, he sat down before it and listened to frequencies that had not carried a legal signal since before some of the men who'd eventually come looking for him were born. Tonight, at 4 minutes past 9, something answered. The gravel popped and crunched under tires meant for pavement, and Deputy Rowan Kirkendall's cruiser came second in the line, boxed in by federal plates front and back, lights spinning red and blue against a column of black government sedans that had no business on a county road built for grain trucks. Lieutenant Commander Devin Prescott was out of the lead vehicle before it had fully stopped, laminated card already in hand, though he hadn't opened it yet, flanked by a dozen men in dark utility gear who moved like water finding the shortest path around the barn's open door. "That receiver," Prescott said, not to Curtis but past him, to the darkness of the barn itself, as though the old man were a fixture he could address later, "is scrap wiring pretending to be equipment, and whatever's coming out of it stops tonight." He held the card up now, flipping through its laminated pages with the reflexive habit of a man who touched it whenever he felt the room slipping. Per the allocation schedule, this frequency has been reserved for federal use only since before you were shaving, old-timer, and every civilian intercept on it is either a fraud or a security breach, and I'm not in a mood tonight to sort out which." Curtis turned his head, right ear leading, and looked at the young officer with the mild patience of a man watching weather roll in that he had already decided not to argue with. "It's neither," he said, "and nothing more," and sat back down in his own chair without offering the second one to anyone. Rowan stood just inside the barn door, hand resting near her radio, out of habit rather than intent, watching the old farmer answer 12 armed strangers and a furious officer with the same unhurried calm he'd have used on a stuck gate hinge. She'd been out here twice before on welfare checks that turned into nothing, an old widower keeping his fences mended and his supper simple, and both times she'd left with the feeling that she'd only seen the visible half of something. Prescott's men fanned into the barn's corners, one running gloved fingers along the antenna feed line as if it might bite him, another already unfolding a laptop on the workbench beside the walnut cabinet, its screen throwing blue light across Curtis's weathered hands. "Sir, this equipment is being confiscated pending review," Prescott said, and a young petty officer stepped toward the cabinet with both hands out. Curtis did not raise his voice, did not rise from his chair, only laid 2 fingers flat against the cabinet's warm wood, the way another man might rest a hand on a horse's neck to still it. "You'll want to hear it through before you carry it anywhere," he said. "It's still talking." The garbled voice bled back through the static then, faint and chopped, and the petty officer froze with his hands still out, unsure now whether he was reaching for evidence or interrupting a conversation already in progress. Prescott waved him back and crossed to the laptop instead, feeding the intercepted audio through a decryption suite that chewed the signal for 11 straight seconds and returned a single flat line of text, no recognized protocol. He tried it again, adjusted a filter, tried a third pass, and the software gave him the same blank verdict each time, patient and useless, while the actual voice kept bleeding through the receiver's speaker in a rhythm that meant nothing to any machine in the barn. Curtis sat with his head canted, eyes half closed, listening the way a man listens to rain to judge how hard it's falling. The cadence had a shape to it, a hop and pause and hop again, 3 fast beats and a long one, a pattern built for ears, trained before satellites did the training for you. He'd heard it first as a 19-year-old sailor half a world from Etheridge County, memorized it the way you memorize a hymn you'll be asked to sing alone someday, and he'd practiced it in this barn on nights when the practicing was the only thing keeping certain hours bearable. "Your software's chewing on ghosts," Curtis said finally, not unkindly, though Prescott's jaw tightened as if it had been. "That's a frequency-hopping pattern out of a curriculum the Navy retired before you were old enough to hold a pencil. No decryption key's going to crack a training cadence built to be learned by a human ear, because it was never meant to be cracked. It was meant to be recognized. There is no training curriculum on record for this band," Prescott said, flipping his laminated card again, though it held nothing that could answer him. "This frequency has been dormant for 31 years. "Dormant," Curtis said, "and listened to. Those aren't the same thing." He held out one weathered hand, palm up, toward the petty officer still hovering near the cabinet. "Somebody hand me a pencil. Not the keyboard. The pencil." The petty officer looked to Prescott, who gave a short, disgusted nod, and a stub of pencil changed hands across a gap of 3 decades and one entire branch of technology. Curtis turned the volume up a half notch, with 2 fingers worn to the exact contour of that brass knob, closed his eyes fully now, and began marking a grid of dots and dashes onto the back of a seed catalog, translating a rhythm no machine in the barn could hear as anything but noise. He worked in silence for the better part of a minute, pencil scratching, static hissing, Prescott standing over him with his arms crossed and his certainty visibly thinning at the edges, though he would not have named it that yet. Rowan stepped closer from the doorway, close enough to read over Curtis's shoulder, and found she recognized nothing on the page except the old man's utter stillness of purpose, a concentration that made the barn feel, for the first time that night, like the only quiet place in the county. You want us to believe an 80-year-old farmer is reading Cold War code off a scrap heap radio faster than a Navy decryption suite, Prescott said, and it wasn't quite a question anymore. I want you to write down what I say next, Curtis answered, and check it against whatever coordinates your last known position log is carrying, because I expect they'll match. He read the pattern back a second time, aloud now, letters and numbers falling out of him in the flat, unhurried cadence of a man reciting his own address, and then he said them a third time, exactly the same, unprompted, purely so there could be no argument about whether the first two readings had been chance. Prescott made him do it a fourth time anyway, standing directly over his shoulder, with his own ear turned toward the speaker, checking the old man's hand against the sound in real time, the way you'd check a witness for a tell. There was no tell. The numbers came out identical every pass. The radio operator, a broad-shouldered young man named Castellan, who had said nothing since stepping out of the lead vehicle, pulled up a tablet of his own and ran the coordinates against a classified tasking board. His face went the color of old paper. "Sir," Castellan said, and his voice had lost every trace of the board competence it had carried into the barn. "That's a match. That's their last confirmed grid. To the meter. That's the recon element we lost contact with at 1840. The barn went silent in a way it hadn't when Curtis stopped talking. A silence with weight to it. The kind that comes when 12 trained men realize simultaneously that the thing they walked in to confiscate is the only working link to 6 of their own. Prescott stood with the laminated card still in his hand, forgotten now, thumb resting on its edge without turning a page, staring at an old farmer in a soft canvas coat, as if the man had rearranged the furniture of what was possible. "Do it again," Prescott said, quieter now, and Curtis did, without complaint, without triumph, because for him, this was not a performance. It was simply the thing he had trained his whole life to be able to do. On the one night, in 3 decades, it had been asked of him by anyone but himself. The relief in the barn lasted the length of one long breath before Castellan's tablet chimed with a second alert, and his face went from paper white to something closer to gray. "Sir," he said again, "this band's slated for the commercial reallocation auction. Satellite Consortium's been bidding on it for months. Window closes at midnight. Once that gate shuts, there's no legal carrier on this frequency for anybody, us included. Doesn't matter if we can talk to them. In 4 hours, there's no channel left to talk on." Prescott looked at his watch, then at the old man's hand-marked dial, then at the walnut cabinet itself, as if it might offer an opinion. "That paperwork was signed off as an unused band," he said, mostly to himself, running a thumb along the laminated card's edge without opening it. "Nobody logged an active listener. Nobody logged anything." "Somebody logged it," Curtis said, tilting his good ear toward the receiver again as the signal thinned to a whisper of static. "He's just not in your paperwork." He reached for the tuning knob to hold the frequency steady, and under his 2 fingers the dial gave a faint, wrong shudder, a stutter in the signal that had nothing to do with the transmission and everything to do with age. The receiver's amber glow flickered once, dimmed, and the garbled voice thinned further still, swallowed half by static that wasn't coming from 30 miles away, but from inside the cabinet itself. "Coil's failing," Curtis said flatly, the way he might report a fence line down in the north pasture. "Same coil since I wound it in 1968. It's held longer than it had any right to, but it's not going to hold through midnight." Prescott crouched beside the cabinet, and for the first time all evening his laminated card stayed in his pocket. "Can you replace it?" "Nobody makes this part anymore," Curtis said. "Nobody's made it in 40 years. I could special order a modern equivalent, but shipping alone would take 3 days, and we don't have 3 days. We've got a handful of hours before that band's sold out from under everybody who might still need it." He turned the knob a fraction, coaxing a thread of signal back through the static, and it held for a few seconds before fraying again. "I'll have to wind a new one myself. Right gauge of copper wire, wound to the right count, or the whole receiver's just an expensive box of tubes." "You have wire like that on hand?" Prescott asked, and something in his voice had shifted from accusation to something closer to a man asking a question he actually wanted answered. Curtis was quiet a moment, eyes half closed, running some private ledger backward through years. "I might," he said. "There was a spool of it I used on a fence repair. Oh, 12, 13 years back. Right gauge, if I remember it true. Buried under 3 feet of ground by now, wherever that stretch of fence sits." "Then we'd better start digging," Rowan said from the doorway, and it was the first thing she'd said since the convoy arrived. Said plainly, the way a person states the next necessary fact, and not a moment sooner. The dig started at the north fence line, under a sky gone the deep bruised blue of full dark. Rowan and 2 of Prescott's men, working post-hole diggers and a borrowed shovel, while Curtis walked the fence itself, counting paces from a post he remembered by the crook in its grain, rather than by any marker a stranger could read. 40 minutes into it, sweat-soaked and grimy to the elbow, Rowan's shovel struck something that gave a dull metallic answer instead of a rock's flat one, and she knelt in the dirt and worked a coil of corroded copper wire free with her bare hands, holding it up in the beam of a flashlight, like something excavated from a much older war than the one anybody in the barn had been fighting. "That's it," Curtis said, crouching beside her with more effort than he let show in his face, testing the wire's gauge between 2 fingers, worn to a precise, private tolerance built over a lifetime of exactly this kind of judgment. "That'll do." While they worked the wire free, Castellan's tablet had been feeding a slow trickle of updated data from the recon element's last telemetry ping, and Rowan, reading over his shoulder in the flashlight glow, frowned at a detail that didn't match the story anyone had told so far. "This says their beacon's stationary," she said. "Not moving, not evading anything. It's been parked in the same spot for 6 hours." Castellan checked the same reading twice before he answered. "They're not lost," he said slowly, as if the words themselves surprised him. "They're pinned. Look at the terrain markers. That's inside the restricted training corridor, not hostile ground. Something mechanical. A drone went down, or a vehicle did, and they're sitting on it, waiting on comms to call it in, not waiting on comms to save their lives." The realization moved through the group the way relief and dread sometimes arrive together, indistinguishable at first. Nobody was in mortal danger tonight, but somebody had built a deadline anyway, a purely administrative one, a frequency closing its gate at midnight, for reasons that had nothing to do with 6 men sitting quiet in the dark, and everything to do with a bidding schedule. Headlights swept the fence line then, a single vehicle this time, no column, no urgency in its approach, and it rolled to a stop with the unhurried authority of someone who had never needed to arrive in a hurry to be taken seriously. A man in his early 60s stepped out, silver-templed, rear admiral stars catching the flashlight beam, and he did not look at Prescott first, or at Rowan, or at the dirt-streaked deputies with their shovels. He looked past all of them to the old farmer kneeling at the fence line with a coil of corroded wire in his hands, and he stood very still for a long moment before he spoke. "Senior Chief," he said, and nothing else, and waited, the way a man waits to see whether a door he hasn't knocked on in 34 years will still open to that particular name. Curtis looked up, right ear turning toward the voice before his eyes fully placed it, and something in his weathered face eased into recognition slow as a tide coming in. "Lieutenant," he said back, though the stars on the man's collar said otherwise now, and neither of them corrected the other, because both titles were true in their own hour. Rear Admiral Austin Renfro crossed the last few feet of dirt between them and, in front of a dozen armed men and 1 furious young officer, went down on 1 knee in the churned earth beside Curtis, not to help with the wire, but simply to be level with him, and he reached into his jacket and produced a folded, yellowed sheet of paper he had clearly carried for longer than made any practical sense. "I wrote this memo 31 years ago," Renfro said, unfolding it with care, "the week after you pulled me and 4 other men off a compromised channel that would have gotten every one of us killed inside 48 hours. I flagged this exact frequency for permanent protection under the old classification. I filed it. I never checked, in 31 years, whether anyone downstream honored it." He held the paper out, not to Prescott, but to Curtis, as if returning something borrowed. "Nobody enforced it, because I never followed up. This whole mess tonight, the auction, the reallocation, all of it, happens because I let a piece of paper do a job that needed a man standing behind it." Prescott took the memo from Renfro's hand when it was offered to him instead, and read it standing in the beam of a flashlight, his jaw working through something that looked, for the first time all night, less like certainty than like the beginning of an apology he didn't yet know how to phrase. Curtis wound the new coil by lamplight on the workbench, copper wire drawn tight around a wooden form he'd shaped decades ago for exactly this purpose, counting turns under his breath in a rhythm nobody else in the barn could follow. 68, 69, 70. His two working fingers guiding each pass with a patience that made the whole slow labor look less like repair than like a kind of prayer performed with the hands instead of the mouth. Renfro stood over him without a word, watching a piece of craft older than most of the men in the barn come back into being. When the coil was seated and the cabinet's back panel closed, Curtis sat down in his own chair, turned the brass knob its 20 familiar degrees, and the signal steadied into something clean enough to carry a voice both ways. He keyed the hand-built transmitter himself, reading the recon element's own frequency-hopping pattern back to them in the cadence they'd been taught to recognize, relaying coordinates and a hold instruction and a promise that extraction was already moving, all of it delivered in the same unhurried, load-bearing sentences he'd used all evening, no more words than the task required. Renfro did not salute him, and did not clap him on the shoulder, and did not say a single word about honor. He simply took the folded memo back from Prescott's hands, walked it over to the workbench, and set it down flat beside the walnut cabinet, weighting it with the same brass tuning knob Curtis had worn smooth over a lifetime, as if returning a debt to the exact place it had first been earned. "Ask him," Renfro said quietly, "to no one and everyone, why there are two chairs." Curtis didn't wait to be asked twice. He looked at the empty chair beside him, dusted clean, angled the same 20 years running toward the dial's glow, and for once he let himself speak past his usual 3 sentences, because the room had, without meaning to, earned the longer answer. "Twila used to sit up with me on these nights," he said. "Not because she cared much for radios, she cared about me not sitting up with the past by myself. 30 years we did it together. Her in that chair, me in this one. Neither of us saying much, just her being there while I listened to whatever the air had to offer. She's been gone 11 years now. I never could bring myself to stop listening, and I never could bring myself to move her chair out of the barn either. Turning this radio off felt like closing a door on the last conversation we ever finished together. So I kept the antenna up, and I kept the chair dusted, and most nights nothing at all comes through but the ordinary dark. Tonight something did. He looked down at the memo, weighted under his own brass knob, and back at Renfro's face, 34 years older than the last time he'd seen it, and no less familiar for the years. "I suppose I've been listening for you longer than either of us knew." Nobody in the barn spoke for a while after that. Rowan stood in the doorway with dirt still under her fingernails, looking at the old man and the empty chair with the particular stillness of someone finally being shown the other half of a story she'd only glimpsed in passing twice before. Prescott stood with Renfro's memo's ghost still in his hands, though he'd already given the paper back, and something in his posture had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with rank. The extraction came through clean before 1 in the morning. 6 men lifted off a stalled reconnaissance drone in the restricted corridor, with no injury worse than a bruised elbow, and word of it reached the barn over Curtis's own receiver, in a voice far steadier than the one that had first bled through the static 4 hours earlier. Prescott logged the confirmation himself, standing at the workbench, and then, without being asked, he took out a notepad and began rewriting his own incident report by hand, striking through civilian interference and writing, in its place, a single line crediting Senior Chief Curtis Ledbetter, retired, by name, for identifying and relaying a distress transmission that would otherwise have gone unanswered. The frequency itself was formally withdrawn from auction 2 days later, pulled from the reallocation schedule under an emergency designation Renfro filed personally, and, this time, followed up on himself, week by week, until the paperwork was airtight. It was reclassified not as dormant federal spectrum, but as a protected listening archive. The file naming Curtis Ledbetter as the frequency's original documented listener, a designation that existed nowhere in any official record until the week a rear admiral decided a piece of paper alone would never again be asked to do a man's job. Prescott drove out once more before the season turned, alone this time, no convoy, no laminated card in his hand at all, and stood in the barn doorway long enough to watch Curtis wind a fresh length of wire onto a spare coil form, purely for practice, the old man's fingers finding the same worn path they always found. He didn't apologize in so many words. He asked, instead, if Curtis would be willing to teach the pattern to two young sailors coming up through the signals program, so the recognition wouldn't die with him. And Curtis said he would, on Tuesdays, if they didn't mind driving out this far for it. Months later, at dusk, the walnut cabinet radio sat at rest on its shelf in the barn, dial glowing faint amber in the settling dark, its hand-marked frequencies unchanged, its brass knob worn to bare metal on the one side where two fingers had turned it every evening of a life. Beside Curtis's own chair, angled the same 20 familiar degrees toward the light, sat the second chair, dusted clean, empty, and exactly where it had always been. Tell us what old skill in your own family nobody ever gave a medal for.